Good evening. My name's Alexander Hernandez, and today I'm going to be talking about William Shakespeare and Hamlet. I hope you enjoy my presentation. So let's get to know a little bit about William Shakespeare. He was an English playwright, poet, and he also was an actor. He was widely regarded as the greatest writer in the English language and the world's preeminent dramatist. He was often called the Baron of Avon. He was born April 1564 in Stratford upon Avon, United Kingdom. He died, unfortunately, April 23rd, 1616, also at Stratford upon Avon, United Kingdom. He had 3 children. So let's get to know a little bit more about his historical background. William Shakespeare is widely regarded as the greatest writer in the history of the English language and the world's preeminent dramatist. He transformed European theater by expanding expectations about what could be accomplished through innovation in characterization, plot, language, and genre. So, some of his favorite plays, or like famous plays in general, are Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, and 4 of like the main themes that he used in his plays were appearance and reality, change, order and disorder, and conflict. Shakespeare's English, it was early modern English, and as you can see, this is a photo of how the letters used to be back then. Now let's get a little bit into Queen Elizabeth. She was the golden first queen of England. Elizabeth I is one of the most famous and renowned queens in history. Elizabeth I has an entire time period named after her, having successfully reigned over England for 44 years in relative peace and much artistic prosperity. Let's talk about how Queen Elizabeth contributed to the Renaissance. Elizabeth I contributed to the Renaissance in a couple of ways. She encouraged and funded expansion abroad, and that calmed the tensions between Protestants and Catholics through Elizabethan religious settlement, and fostered a gradual acceptance of the Protestant Reformation that had begun during the Renaissance. Elizabeth I reintroduced religious reformation to England, but she also represented the Renaissance, sharing the mischievous belief in a one or more or less unscrupulous leader. She recognized the need for some religion in order to ensure social stability although she personally despised theological dogmas. The Queen demanded outer conformity in order to protect the national unity. Everybody was allowed to believe what he or she wanted to believe, and as long as he or she obeyed the law, everything was fine. So let's talk about Shakespeare's Renaissance. Well, William Shakespeare contributed to the Renaissance by creating a new style of writing plays. He mixed comedy and tragedy, which back then was a big deal. Another contribution Shakespeare made to the Renaissance was the Globe Theatre. It was built by his playing company in 1599, but burned down in June of 1613. Shakespeare lived during the height of the English Renaissance, and this is clearly reflected in his plays and poems. Like all writers and artists, he was influenced by what was going on around him, and he would adopt the common ways of thinking into his work. Now let's talk about literary devices in Hamlet. Act 1, Scene 1. In the moist star, upon whose influence Neptune's empire stands, was sick almost to doomsday with eclipse. This is an allusion to Neptune, the Roman god of the sea. Act 1, Scene 2. So excellent a king that was to this Hyperion to Satyr. This is an allusion to Hyperion, one of the Titans, a superhuman race in Greek mythology that ruled the world before the Olympian gods. Act 1, Scene 3. As heartily as the Nemean lion's nerve. This is an allusion to the Nemean lion, a monstrous creature in Greek mythology that could not be killed with human weapons. Now let's talk about literary devices in Hamlet, but simul. Part 1. And then it started like a guilty thing upon a fearful summons. When the ghost disappeared at the sound of a crowing rooster, Horatio uses this simile to compare the ghost's reaction to that of a guilty person who panics when caught in the act. Part 2. Be thou as chisel as ice, as pure as snow, thou shalt not escape calumny. Speaking to Ophelia, Hamlet uses a simile to compare chastity to ice and snow, suggesting that it is both pure and cold or lacking in compassion. So now these are other symbols. Part 3. The seat of majesty dies not alone but like a gulf. Doth draw what's near it with it. Attempting to flatter Claudius, Rosencrantz used this symbol to compare a king to a vast body of water who, if he were to die, would drag many others along with him like a receding wave pulling by bystanders out to sea. Part 4. Who, dipping all his faults in their affection, would like the spring that turneth wood to stone, convert his gyves to graces. In this simile, Claudius compares the common people's love for Hamlet to a magical spring that can transform wood into stone. Although guilty of killing Polonius, Hamlet's shackles would likewise be transformed into graces in the eyes of the people if he were punished. Now let's talk about some metaphors. Part 1. But look, the morn, in russet mantle clad, walks o'er the dew of yon high eastern hill. In this metaphor, Horatio compares the sunrise to a person in a reddish cloak appearing from a distant hilltop. Part 2. Fions a fi. This, an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely. In this metaphor, Hamlet compares the world to a garden in which weeds have taken over and began to multiply. Part 3. Think yourself a baby that you have tamed these tenders for true pay, which are not steering. This is kind of a double metaphor. Polonius calls Ophelia a baby, suggesting that she is naive by believing that Hamlet has any affections. Tenders for all are true, when in fact they are like counterfeit silver coins. Part 4. The serpent that did sting thy father's life now wears his crown. In this metaphor, the ghost of Hamlet's father compares Claudius to a poisonous snake who bit him and then took over as king after his death. Hamlet's characters. Hamlet, the prince. He was the prince of Denmark. He was like the protagonist of the story. He was about 30 years old at the start of the play. Hamlet is the son of the Queen Gertrude and the late King Hamlet, and the nephew of the present King Claudius. Hamlet is melancholically bitter and cynical, full of hatred for his uncle's scheming and disgust for his mother's sexuality. A reflective and thoughtful young man who has studied at the University of Wittenberg, Hamlet is often indecisive and hesitant, but at all times prone to rash and impulsive acts. Now let's talk about Claudius. Claudius, well, at the moment, he's the king of Denmark after his brother unfortunately died, and his brother's wife married him. He's the king of Denmark. He's Hamlet's uncle, and he's the play's antagonist. He's the villain of the play. Claudius is a calculating, ambitious politician driven by his sexual appetites and his lust for power. He occasionally shows signs of guilt and human feeling. His love for Gertrude, for instance, seems sincere. Now let's talk about Gertrude, his wife. The Queen of Denmark. She's Hamlet's mother, and she recently married to Claudius, Hamlet's uncle. Gertrude loves Hamlet deeply, but she is a shallow, weak woman who seeks affection and status more urgently than moral rectitude or truth. Polonius. Well, he was the lord of Chamberlain of Claudius's court, and he was a pompous, conniving old man, and Polonius is the father of Laertes and Ophelia. Now, let's see who's Horatio. Horatio, he was Hamlet's close friend who studied with the prince at the university in Wittenberg. Horatio is a loyal and helpful to Hamlet. And throughout the play, after Hamlet's death, Horatio remains alive to tell Hamlet's story. Now let's talk about Ophelia. She was Polonius's daughter, and she was a beautiful young woman with whom Hamlet has been in love with. Ophelia is a sweet and innocent young girl who obeys her father and her brother Laertes. She's very dependent on men to tell her how to behave, and she gives in to Polonius's schemes to spy on Hamlet. Even in her lapse into madness and death, she remains radiantly singing songs about flowers and finally drowning in the river amid the flower garlands she had gathered. Now let's talk about Laertes. Well, he's Polonius's son and Ophelia's brother, and he's a young man who spends much of the play in France. He's passionate and quick to action, and Laertes is clearly a foe for the reflective Hamlets. Fortinbras. Well, he was the young prince of Norway, whose father, the king, also named Fortinbras, was killed by Hamlet's father, also named Hamlet. Now Fortinbras wishes to attack Denmark to avenge his father's honor, making him another foe for Prince Hamlet. Now let's talk about the ghost in the story. The ghost, who claims to have been murdered by Claudius, calls upon Hamlet to avenge him. However, it is not entirely certain whether the ghost is what it appears to be or whether it is something else. Hamlet speculates that the ghost might be an devil sent to deceive him and tempt him into murder. And the question of what the ghost is or where it comes from is never definitively resolved. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Well, these two were two slightly bumbling courtiers, former friends of Hamlet from Wittenberg, who are summoned by Claudius and Gertrude to discover the cause of Hamlet's strange behavior lately. Osric, the foolish courtier who summoned Hamlet into his duel with Laertes. Now let's talk about Voltimand and Cornelius. These two were courtiers whom Claudius sends to Norway to pursue the king to prevent Fortinbras from attacking. Marcellus and Bernardo. Well, these are the officers who first see the ghost walking the ramparts of Elsinore and who summoned Horatio to witness it, since they couldn't believe their eyes that they had seen a ghost. So they wanted to confirm before telling Hamlet. Francisco. He is a soldier and guardsman at Elsinore. Reynaldo. Well, he was Polonius's servant who is sent to France by Polonius to check up on and spy on Laertes. Marcellus is present when Hamlet first encounters the ghost. Now let's talk about the setting in Hamlet. Elsinore is the English spelling of Helsingør, a town on the eastern coast of Denmark in Shakespeare's lifetime. Now let's get into the conflict of the story. The conflict happened between an individual to another individual. So basically, Helsingør was an important military location. It was the stronghold from which the King of Denmark controlled a narrow stretch of sea A fortress had stood in the town since the Middle Ages. In between 1574 and 1585, Frederick II of Denmark rebuilt the fortress as a magnificent castle. Will Kent, a member of Shakespeare's acting company, probably visited the castle at Helsingor to perform the Frederick, who was an enthusiastic patron of theater. So Shakespeare likely knew where the town was and what its castle was like. The threat of invasion from neighboring countries is essential to the plot of Hamlet, which ends with the Norway Prince 14 storming the castle. The threat of invasion also contributes to Hamlet's mood of anxious and uncertainty. Well, the conflict was, it is found that Hamlet has like a great anger to Claudius and wants to kill him because Claudius murders his father and marries his mother. In the match of sword with Laertes, Hamlet has a second chance to kill Claudius. These are some of the conflicts in the story, like man versus man, which is Laertes versus Hamlet. The men argued and eventually they fought over the death of Polonius and Ophelia. Man versus society, Hamlet versus court. Hamlet struggles with the Danish court. Convention has placed Claudius on his brother's throne and allowed him to marry Gertrude, both of which upset Hamlet. Hamlet was very upset since his uncle had married his mother and his mother had married his uncle like a month after his father had died. He was still grieving, but his mother got married immediately. Now, the plot in Shakespeare and Hamlet. Well, there's 3 plots, so let's get started with the first one. The first one is the main revenge plot and 2 subplots involving the romance between Hamlet and Ophelia and the looming war in Norway. The impossibility of certainty. This theme is particularly from Hamlet himself, is continually postponed while Hamlet tries to obtain more certain knowledge about what he is doing. This play poses many questions that other plays would simply take for granted. Many people have seen Hamlet as a play about indecisiveness and thus about Hamlet's failure to act appropriately. The second theme, the mystery of death. What separates Hamlet from other revenge plays, and maybe from every play written before it, is that the action we expect to see. Hamlet himself appears to distrust the idea that it's even possible to act in a controlled, purposeful way. When he does act, he prefers to do it blindly, recklessly, and violently. The other characters obviously think much less about action in the abstract than Hamlet does, and are therefore less troubled about the possibility of acting effectively. They simply act as they feel is appropriate, but in some sense they prove that Hamlet is right, because all of their actions miscarry. Claudius possesses himself for queen and crowned through bold action, but his conscience torments him, and he is beset by threats to his authority, and of course he dies. The third theme and the final one, the nation as a deceased body. In Hamlet, the question of how to act is affected not only by rational considerations, such as the need for certainty, but also by emotional, ethical, and psychological factors. He ponders both of the spiritual aftermath of death embodied in the ghost and the physical reminders of the dead, such as by Eureka's skull and the decaying corpses in the cemetery. Throughout, the idea of death is closely tied to the themes of spirituality, truth, and uncertainty, and that death may bring the answers to Hamlet's deepest questions, ending once and for all the problem of trying to determine truth in this ambiguous world. And since death is both the cause In the consequence of revenge, it is imi- intimately tied to the theme of revenge and justice. Claudius' murder of King Hamlet initiates Hamlet's quest for revenge, and Claudius' death is the end of that quest. In the aftermath of his father's murder, Hamlet is obsessed with the idea of death, and over the course of the play, he considers death from a great and many perspectives. As we can see here, I put like a little map for you guys. This is basically the history of English language. As we can see, the first one was Celtic migrations. That was 1000 BC before Christ. The second one was Roman occupation, 43 till 400 CE. And the second one was Germanic settlements, that was in like the late 400s, and Viking invasions that were near like the 780s to 1000s, and the Norman invasions 1000s to 1154, the Renaissance mixing, which was in the late 1400s till 1600s, and finally the Empire imports, that was in the 1700s till present. As we can see here, this is basically like the whole map of the history of English. It goes from the beginning to where we are present today. Now, if you guys want to see, you're able to pause it and look a little bit more at the map. But now let's talk about the Globe Theatre. Well, the Globe Theatre, it was a theater in London. Well, that was associated with William Shakespeare. It was built in 1599 at Southwark, close to the south bank of the Thames, by Shakespeare's playing company, the Lord Chamberlain Men. It was destroyed by fire on 29 June 1613. Basically, it was destroyed. It basically caught on fire, and unfortunately, well, it's not there anymore. I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation, and that'll be all from my part. I hope you liked it. Thank you for your attention.